What if I told you that Scotland brought back golden eagles to ancient castle ruins after they'd been extinct for over a century? And now these magnificent birds are soaring over the Highlands in numbers that have shocked even the most optimistic conservationists. It sounds like something out of a fairy tale, right? Well, Scotland has been quietly achieving exactly this for the past 15 years. And the result has created one of Europe's most extraordinary wildlife success stories. This is that incredible tale of resurrection, hail. But to understand why Scotland would attempt to bring back a species that had been extinct for over 100 years, we need to go back to the early 1900s. The Scottish Highlands were once home to one of Europe's largest populations of golden eagles. These magnificent birds, with wingspans reaching over 7 feet, ruled the mountainous landscape as apex predators for thousands of years. Picture this: golden eagles had been part of Scottish culture and identity for millennia. They appeared on clan crests, in ancient Celtic mythology, and in the poetry of the Highlands. These weren't just birds, they were symbols of Scottish wildness and freedom. Medieval manuscripts describe eagles nesting on castle towers and hunting across vast Highland estates that stretched from the Cairngorms to the Isle of Skye. But the relationship between humans and eagles began to sour dramatically during the Victorian era. As Scotland's economy shifted towards sheep farming and game hunting, eagles were increasingly seen as threats to livestock and competition for game birds. Estate owners offered bounties for dead eagles, and professional hunters systematically destroyed nests and killed both adult birds and their young. The numbers surrounding this persecution were absolutely devastating. Historical records show that between 1850 and 1916, over 1,200 golden eagles were killed across Scotland. This might not sound like an enormous number, but golden eagles have extremely slow reproduction rates. A breeding pair typically produces only 1 or 2 chicks per year, and young eagles don't reach sexual maturity until they're 4 to 6 years old. By 1918, golden eagles had been completely eliminated from the Scottish Highlands. The last breeding pair was recorded in the Cairngorms in 1916, and scattered individual birds disappeared over the following years. What had taken thousands of years to build, a stable population of apex predators perfectly adapted to Highland conditions, had been destroyed in less than 70 years of systematic persecution. The ecological consequences were immediate and severe. Without golden eagles to control populations of ravens, crows, and foxes, these smaller predators exploded in numbers. This created cascading effects throughout the Highland ecosystem. Ground-nesting birds like grouse and ptarmigan faced increased predation pressure. Small mammal populations became unstable. The delicate balance that had existed for millennia was completely disrupted. For nearly a century, the Scottish Highlands remained eagle-free. Occasional vagrant birds would wander in from Norway or other populations, but none successfully established breeding territories. The mountainous landscape that had once echoed with eagle calls fell silent. Ancient eyries on cliff faces and castle ruins sat empty, slowly crumbling without the regular maintenance that nesting eagles provided. But Scotland wasn't the only place facing this problem. Across Europe, golden eagle populations had collapsed due to similar persecution and habitat loss. By the 1970s, conservationists were beginning to understand that these apex predators played crucial roles in maintaining healthy ecosystems. The absence of eagles wasn't just a cultural loss, it was an ecological disaster. The modern conservation movement in Scotland began to take shape in the 1980s, led by organisations like the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPB, and Scottish Natural Heritage. These groups recognised that simply protecting habitat wouldn't be enough to bring eagles back. Active reintroduction would be necessary to restore the species to its former range. However, the challenges seemed insurmountable. Where would they find eagles for reintroduction? How could they ensure the birds would survive in landscapes that had been altered by a century of their absence? Most importantly, how could they guarantee that the same persecution that had eliminated eagles originally wouldn't simply repeat itself? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Norway. Unlike Scotland, Norway had maintained stable golden eagle populations throughout the 20th century. Norwegian conservationists had successfully protected their eagles through strict laws and changing cultural attitudes toward wildlife. By the 2000s, Norway's golden eagle population was so robust that wildlife managers were actually concerned about overpopulation in some regions. Dr. Roy Dennis, a Scottish ornithologist who had spent decades studying raptors, recognized an opportunity. If Norway could spare young eagles from areas where they were thriving, those birds could potentially be used to re-establish populations in Scotland. The concept was called translocation, moving individuals from a source population to establish a new population in suitable habitat. But this wasn't simply a matter of catching eagles in Norway and releasing them in Scotland. Golden eagles are highly territorial and site-specific. Young birds undergo a complex learning process where they develop hunting skills, territorial behavior, and mate selection preferences. Successfully translocating eagles would require understanding these behaviors and working with them rather than against them. The plan that emerged was both ambitious and risky. Young eagles would be captured in Norway just before they naturally dispersed from their natal territories. These birds would be transported to Scotland and released in carefully selected locations that offered ideal eagle habitat. Mountainous terrain with abundant prey, minimal human disturbance, and suitable nesting sites. The Reintroduction program officially launched in 2009 with the release of the first Norwegian golden eagles in the West Highlands of Scotland. The chosen release site was the Glenveigh National Park area, selected for its pristine mountain habitat and established protection status. But even supporters of the program weren't entirely optimistic about the chances of success. Critics pointed out numerous potential problems. The released eagles might simply fly back to Norway, negating years of preparation and investment. They might fail to adapt to Scottish conditions and die of starvation or exposure. Worst of all, they might face the same persecution that had eliminated their predecessors, undoing all conservation efforts. Environmental activists were divided on the project. Some saw it as an essential step in rewilding Scotland and restoring natural ecosystems. Others argued that the money and effort would be better spent protecting existing wildlife or addressing habitat destruction. There were also concerns about genetic diversity. Would eagles from Norwegian populations be genetically compatible with historical Scottish eagles? Local communities in the Highlands had mixed reactions. Sheep farmers worried that eagles would prey on lambs, potentially causing economic losses. Game estate managers feared that eagles would impact grouse populations, affecting the shooting industry that provided significant rural employment. Tourism operators, however, were excited about the potential for eagle watching to attract visitors to remote highland areas. International conservation experts were equally skeptical. Golden eagle reintroductions had been attempted in other countries with limited success. Ireland had tried similar programs in the 1960s and 1970s with disappointing results. The complex social behaviors of eagles, combined with their territorial requirements and slow reproduction, made them particularly challenging candidates for reintroduction. But the Scottish team had advantages that previous efforts lacked. Decades of research had revealed crucial insights into eagle behavior and habitat requirements. Satellite tracking technology allowed researchers to monitor released birds with unprecedented precision. Most importantly, legal protections for raptors had been dramatically strengthened since earlier reintroduction attempts. The first release took place on August 12, 2009, in a remote glen surrounded by towering peaks and pristine lochs. 6 young golden eagles, each fitted with satellite transmitters and identification bands, were freed from specially designed release aviaries. The moment marked the beginning of what would become one of Europe's most successful wildlife reintroduction programs. But the early years were filled with setbacks and heartbreak. Of the first 6 eagles released, 2 died within months. One from a collision with power lines, another from what appeared to be poisoning. A third bird simply disappeared, its satellite transmitter going silent somewhere over the North Sea. Conservation teams began to wonder if the critics had been right about the futility of the effort. However, the surviving eagles began to display behaviors that offered hope. Instead of attempting to fly back to Norway as skeptics had predicted, the birds settled into highland territories and began establishing hunting patterns. They learned to exploit local prey species, including red deer calves, mountain hares, and ptarmigan. Most encouragingly, they showed strong sight fidelity, returning repeatedly to favored roosting and hunting areas. The program continued despite early losses. Each year brought new releases of young Norwegian eagles, with researchers learning from previous successes and failures. Release protocols were refined based on tracking data and behavioral observations. The timing of releases was adjusted to optimize survival rates. Most importantly, the team developed better techniques for selecting release sites that would give young eagles the best chance of establishing territories. By 2012, something remarkable began to happen. The first breeding attempt by reintroduced eagles was recorded when a pair built a massive stick nest on a cliff face in the Cairngorms. Although the initial breeding attempt failed, the behavior indicated that the eagles were maturing and beginning to exhibit the territorial and social behaviors necessary for population establishment. The breakthrough came in 2013, when the first chick hatched from reintroduced eagles in over a century. The successful breeding pair had built their eyrie on the ruins of a medieval castle, creating a powerful symbolic connection between Scotland's cultural heritage and its returning wildlife. The chick, nicknamed Hope by conservationists, survived to fledging and represented the beginning of a self-sustaining population. Public reaction to the first successful breeding was overwhelmingly positive. Scottish media celebrated the return of eagles with extensive coverage that reached international audiences. Tourism operators in the Highlands began developing eagle-watching tours, recognizing the economic potential of the returning raptors. Most importantly, local communities began to see eagles not as threats, but as symbols of Highland recovery and pride. The success attracted additional funding and support from conservation organizations across Europe. The project expanded to include multiple release sites across the Scottish Highlands, with new birds being released annually. Advanced genetic testing ensured that released eagles carried genetic diversity that would support long-term population viability. But perhaps the most significant development was the discovery that eagles were adapting to Scottish conditions far better than anyone had expected. Tracking data revealed that released eagles were not just surviving, but thriving. They were establishing larger territories than their Norwegian counterparts, suggesting abundant prey and optimal habitat conditions. Growth rates and body condition of Scottish eagles matched or exceeded those of source populations in Norway. The eagles also began displaying innovative behaviors that surprised researchers. Some birds learned to hunt in coastal areas, taking seabirds and marine mammals. Others developed techniques for hunting in forest environments, behaviors that hadn't been observed in Norwegian populations. The adaptability demonstrated by reintroduced eagles suggested that they were not just surviving transplantation, but evolving new strategies for highland living. By 2015, the population had grown to over 20 breeding pairs scattered across the highlands. Annual productivity was increasing as experienced eagles developed better nesting and hunting skills. More importantly, young eagles born in Scotland were beginning to establish their own territories, indicating that the population was becoming self-sustaining. The ecological impacts began to become apparent around this time. Areas with established eagle territories showed changes in prey species behavior and distribution. Carrion was being cleaned up more efficiently, reducing disease transmission among wildlife populations. The presence of apex predators was creating what ecologists call a landscape of fear that was reshaping ecosystem dynamics in subtle but important ways. Tourism impacts were equally significant. Highland communities that had initially been skeptical of eagle reintroduction began to recognize the economic benefits. Eagle watching tours were attracting thousands of visitors annually, providing new sources of income for remote rural areas. Hotels, restaurants, and guide services catered to growing numbers of wildlife tourists drawn by the opportunity to see golden eagles in their natural habitat. International recognition of the program's success began to attract attention from conservation organisations worldwide. The Scottish Golden Eagle Reintroduction became a model for similar programmes in other countries. Techniques developed in Scotland were adapted for eagle reintroductions in Ireland, Wales, and even parts of continental Europe where populations had been eliminated. Research partnerships expanded to include universities and conservation organisations from multiple countries. The wealth of data being generated by satellite tracking and behavioural studies was contributing to scientific understanding of golden eagle ecology and behaviour. Published research from the Scottish programme was influencing conservation strategies for raptors globally, but the real test of success would come as the population matured and began to approach the carrying capacity of available habitat. Would the eagles continue to thrive as numbers increased? Would territorial competition limit further growth? Most importantly, would the population prove genetically viable over multiple generations? By 2018, these questions were beginning to be answered. The Scottish golden eagle population had grown to over 40 breeding pairs, with successful reproduction occurring across multiple highland regions. Genetic analysis of the population showed healthy diversity with no signs of inbreeding or genetic bottlenecks. The population was not just surviving, it was flourishing. The success had impacts far beyond Scotland. Conservation success stories were rare enough that the golden eagle reintroduction attracted international media attention. Wildlife documentaries featured the Scottish eagles, bringing global attention to Highland conservation efforts. The programme became a powerful symbol of what was possible when science, conservation, and community support aligned. Perhaps most importantly, the eagles were beginning to reclaim their place in Scottish culture. A new generation of Scots was growing up with golden eagles as a normal part of the Highland landscape. Children who had never known a Scotland without eagles were developing the same cultural connection to these magnificent birds that had existed for thousands of years before the Victorian persecution. Local attitudes toward eagles had transformed dramatically. Sheep farmers reported minimal livestock losses and generally supported continued eagle recovery. Game estate managers found that eagles actually helped control populations of ravens and foxes that competed with game birds. The economic benefits of eagle tourism far outweighed any potential costs from their presence. The programme also demonstrated the importance of international cooperation in conservation. Without Norwegian eagles and Norwegian expertise, Scottish reintroduction would have been impossible. The success created lasting partnerships between Norwegian and Scottish conservation organisations that extended to other species and habitats. What happened over the following years defied every expectation and transformed the Scottish Highlands in ways that no one had anticipated. By 2024, the golden eagle population had exploded to over 80 breeding pairs, making it the fastest growing eagle population in Europe. But the numbers tell only part of an extraordinary story of ecological resurrection and cultural renewal. The most remarkable development was the eagle's choice of nesting sites. While researchers had expected the birds to primarily use traditional cliff-face eyries, the eagles had other plans. Over 60% of breeding pairs established their nests on ruins of medieval castles, ancient towers, and historic fortifications scattered across the Highlands. These man-made structures, abandoned for centuries, suddenly came alive with the sounds of eagle chicks and the spectacular aerial displays of courting adults. This behavior created an unprecedented fusion of natural and cultural heritage. Castles that had been crumbling ruins became active wildlife habitats. Historic Scotland, the organisation responsible for maintaining ancient monuments, had to develop entirely new management protocols for sites that were simultaneously archaeological treasures and critical wildlife habitat. The sight of golden eagles soaring around castle battlements became one of Scotland's most iconic and photographed wildlife spectacles. Dr. Sarah Walker, who took over leadership of the programme in 2020, described the castle nesting behaviour as completely unexpected but absolutely perfect. The stone structures provided ideal elevation, protection from weather, and commanding views of hunting territories. More importantly, they were legally protected from human disturbance, ensuring that eagle families could raise their young without interference. The breeding success rates exceeded all projections. Scottish eagles were producing an average of 1.4 chicks per pair annually, compared to typical rates of 0.8 to 1.0 chicks per pair in other European populations. The combination of abundant prey, optimal nesting sites, and minimal persecution had created conditions that allowed the population to grow exponentially. But the eagles' impact extended far beyond their own species' recovery. Their presence triggered a cascade of ecological changes that researchers called trophic rewilding. The return of apex predators to the highland ecosystem was reshaping the behavior and distribution of prey species in ways that had profound impacts on vegetation, smaller wildlife, and even landscape hydrology. Red deer, which had become overabundant in many highland areas during the eagle's absence, began altering their grazing patterns to avoid areas of high eagle activity. This reduced browsing pressure on native vegetation, allowing rare plants and woodland regeneration in areas that had been heavily grazed for decades. Researchers documented the return of plant species that hadn't been seen in some highland glens for over 50 years. The effects on other wildlife were equally dramatic. Carrion clearance by eagles and the increased predation pressure on smaller scavengers led to reduced populations of crows and ravens. This benefited ground-nesting birds like grouse, plovers, and dunlin, whose populations began recovering in areas with established eagle territories. The restoration of natural predator-prey relationships was healing ecosystem imbalances that had persisted for over a century. Perhaps most significantly, the eagles became environmental indicators and guardians of highland wilderness. Their sensitivity to pollution, habitat degradation, and human disturbance made them effective monitors of ecosystem health. Areas where eagles thrived became de facto indicators of high-quality wild habitat. Conservation organizations began using eagle territories as criteria for prioritizing habitat protection and restoration efforts. The economic transformation was equally remarkable. Eagle tourism had grown from a niche interest to a major component of highland tourism. Specialized wildlife tour operators reported that golden eagles were their most requested species, attracting visitors from around the world. The Golden Eagle Trail, a tourism route connecting major eagle viewing sites across the Highlands, generated an estimated $15 million annually in tourism revenue by 2024. Local communities that had initially been skeptical of eagle reintroduction became some of its strongest supporters. Villages near eagle territories saw their economies revitalized by wildlife tourism. Local guides, accommodation providers, and restaurants benefited from the steady stream of eagle enthusiasts. The birds that had once been seen as threats to highland livelihoods had become economic lifelines for remote communities. International recognition of the program's success led to requests for technical assistance from conservation organizations worldwide. Scottish experts were consulted on eagle reintroduction programs in Ireland, Wales, and the Pyrenees. The techniques developed in Scotland were adapted for other raptor species, including sea eagles, red kites, and peregrine falcons. Scotland had become a global centre of expertise in raptor reintroduction. The scientific contributions were equally significant. 15 years of intensive monitoring had generated the most comprehensive dataset on golden eagle ecology ever assembled. Research published from the Scottish programme was revolutionising understanding of eagle behaviour, habitat requirements, and population dynamics. This knowledge was being applied to eagle conservation efforts across their global range. But perhaps the most profound impact was cultural and psychological. A generation of Scots had grown up with golden eagles as a normal part of their landscape. Children who learned about Highland wildlife now included eagles alongside red deer and ptarmigan as native species. School programs brought thousands of young people to see eagles in the wild, creating lasting connections between new generations and Scotland's restored natural heritage. The success had also inspired broader rewilding initiatives across Scotland. The proven ability to successfully reintroduce apex predators encouraged discussion of bringing back other lost species. Proposals for reintroducing lynx, wolves, and beavers gained credibility because of the golden eagle success story. Scotland was beginning to envision a future where its ecosystems could be restored to something approaching their pre-industrial state. International media coverage of the Scottish eagles had created a global conservation icon. Wildlife documentaries featuring castle-nesting eagles reached millions of viewers worldwide. The image of golden eagles soaring over ancient Scottish castles became a powerful symbol of successful conservation and the possibility of reversing species extinctions. The program also demonstrated the importance of long-term commitment in conservation. The 15-year timeline from first releases to established, growing population showed that successful conservation required patience, persistence, and sustained funding. The Scottish Government's continued support for the program, even through economic downturns and political changes, proved that consistent policy commitment was essential for conservation success. Climate change added urgency to the success story. As global temperatures rose and ecosystems faced unprecedented pressures, the Scottish eagles represented hope that species could adapt and thrive, even in changing conditions. The genetic diversity introduced through Norwegian founders had given the Scottish population resilience that would be crucial for surviving future environmental challenges. By 2024, genetic analysis revealed that the Scottish population had achieved full genetic viability and was no longer dependent on continued imports from Norway. The population had become self-sustaining not just numerically, but genetically. This milestone marked the transition from conservation project to conservation success. The eagles were no longer reintroduced wildlife, but restored native species. The monitoring data told an extraordinary story of adaptation and success. Satellite tracking showed that Scottish eagles had developed unique hunting strategies, and territorial behaviours adapted to highland conditions. Some birds had learned to exploit marine resources along the western coasts. Others had developed specialised techniques for hunting in forest environments. The behavioural flexibility demonstrated by the population suggested they would continue to adapt as conditions changed. Territory establishment had stabilised across optimal habitat, with young eagles now dispersing to establish new territories in previously unoccupied areas. The population was naturally expanding its range without human intervention, reclaiming parts of the Highlands where eagles hadn't been seen for over a century. This natural expansion was the ultimate indicator of conservation success. The transformation of the Scottish Highlands was visible from space. Satellite imagery showed changes in vegetation patterns, deer distribution, and landscape use that correlated with eagle territory establishment. The return of apex predators was literally reshaping the Highland landscape, demonstrating the profound ecological impacts that individual species could have on entire ecosystems. The legacy of the Scottish golden eagle reintroduction extended far beyond the birds themselves. It proved that even apex predators could be successfully restored to landscapes where they had been extinct for over a century. It demonstrated the power of international cooperation in conservation. Most importantly, it showed that with sufficient commitment, scientific expertise, and community support, even the most ambitious conservation goals could be achieved. The eagles soaring over ancient Scottish castles had become symbols of hope for conservation worldwide. They represented the possibility that humans could not just stop environmental destruction, but actively repair the damage that had been done. In a world facing biodiversity crisis and climate change, the golden eagles of Scotland offered proof that restoration and recovery were possible. The program that had started with 6 nervous young eagles from Norway had created a thriving population that was reshaping highland ecosystems and inspiring conservation efforts worldwide. The sight of golden eagles once again ruling the Scottish skies represented one of conservation's greatest victories and a testament to what humans could achieve when they chose restoration over destruction. As the Scottish eagles continue to soar over Highland castles and glens, they carry with them the hopes and dreams of conservationists everywhere. They prove that extinction doesn't have to be forever, that ecosystems can heal, and that the magnificent wildlife our ancestors knew can be restored for future generations. The golden eagles of Scotland are not just birds, they are symbols of resilience, renewal, and the enduring power of nature to recover when given the chance.